Lori Tackett. On January 10, 1992, authorities in Madison, Indiana, responded to a report that would lead them to one of the most disturbing cases involving teenage perpetrators in the state's history. The investigation began after 2 of the 4 girls involved came forward to confess what had happened the previous night. What officers discovered was a crime that shocked the community and raised profound questions about how such extreme harm could be inflicted by such young individuals acting in concert. Lori Tackett, who was 17 at the time, had been the oldest of the 4 girls involved in the incident. Born on October 5, 1974, Tackett had a documented history of mental health struggles, including borderline personality disorder, self-harm behaviors, and experiencing hallucinations that affected her perception of reality. Her background revealed a troubled childhood marked by instability, trauma, and experiences that had contributed significantly to her psychological difficulties. These factors would later be presented during legal proceedings as important context for understanding her state of mind and capacity for judgment. The incident occurred after the group abducted a young person from her father's home under false pretenses late in the evening. The plan had been orchestrated primarily by Melinda Loveless, who was 16, motivated by jealousy over a romantic relationship that had developed between the victim and Loveless's former girlfriend. However, Tackett's role significantly escalated the situation beyond what might have originally been intended. The group drove to a location known locally as the Witch's Castle, a ruined stone structure in a remote area, where Tackett made disturbing statements about human remains and participated actively in the harm that followed. Forensic evidence collected from multiple scenes painted a detailed and horrifying picture of what had transpired over several hours. Investigators found biological evidence in Tackett's car trunk, at her residence where the victim had been taken at one point, and at the final location where the victim had been left in a field. The autopsy revealed extensive injuries numbering over 50, covering the victim's body, with the medical examiner determining the cause of death after thorough examination. The forensic analysis confirmed that the victim had still been alive during the final stage of the attack when gasoline was poured and ignited, making the crime particularly egregious in the eyes of investigators and prosecutors. The investigation moved quickly once Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence, the 2 younger members of the group, who were 15 and 15 respectively, came forward to authorities on January 11th. Their detailed confessions provided investigators with specific locations to search and evidence to collect, essentially breaking the case open. All 4 girls were arrested on January 12, 1992, less than 48 hours after the crime occurred. The physical evidence, including dental records used for identification and items found at various locations involved in the crime, corroborated the confessions and built a strong case against all 4 individuals involved. During interrogations, investigators learned about the dynamics among the 4 perpetrators. Tackett had been the one who provided much of the escalation, with witnesses later recounting that she had laughed while describing what happened. Her mental state and the influence of her psychological disorders became central to understanding her role. However, the calculated nature of the planning and execution suggested awareness of the actions being taken. The legal proceedings involved all 4 defendants accepting plea agreements to avoid the death penalty, which could have been pursued given the severity of the crime. Tackett pleaded guilty to charges, including criminal confinement and arson, on September 21, 1992, receiving a 60-year sentence. The other 3 received varying sentences. Loveless got 60 years, Rippey received 35 years, and Lawrence was sentenced to 20 years. During sentencing, the court heard impact statements that revealed the profound devastation experienced by the victim's family. The victim's mother, Jacques Vaught, spoke about how her former husband had struggled with grief so severely that he eventually passed away, stating he died from a broken heart. The family's pain was evident throughout the proceedings, and their statements emphasized the permanent loss they had suffered. Tackett served 25 years of her sentence before being released on January 11, 2018, with probation requirements that included restrictions on her movements and associations. Her release sparked renewed public discussion about appropriate sentencing for juvenile offenders who commit serious crimes. Loveless was released in 2019, while Rippey and Lawrence had been released in 2006 and 2000 respectively, all serving significantly reduced portions of their sentences due to good behavior and the consideration of their ages at the time of the crime. As of 2025, Tackett has maintained a low profile since her release. The next case would demonstrate how a seemingly minor dispute could escalate with deadly consequences. Rebecca Douglas. On April 10, 2012, a street confrontation in Battersea, London, ended with a young person being fatally injured, using an ordinary grooming item as a weapon. Rebecca Douglas, who was 15 at the time, struck 16-year-old Julie Sheriff during an argument on a London street. The weapon was a metal pintail afro comb, a grooming tool that became lethal when used with force to inflict harm. Julie Sheriff had emigrated from Sierra Leone to London seeking better opportunities for her education and future. She was known as a respectful and hard-working young person who was building a life in her adopted country. On that April afternoon, she encountered Douglas on the street, and an argument erupted between them. The confrontation stemmed from ongoing tensions involving rumors and disputes about romantic interests. Douglas, who was experiencing homelessness at the time and sleeping rough on London's streets, had been carrying the metal comb when the argument occurred. During the heated exchange, she struck Sheriff in the head with the comb. The metal prongs of the styling tool penetrated Sheriff's skull, causing immediate and severe injury. Sheriff collapsed at the scene, and emergency services rushed her to the hospital, where doctors discovered the extent of the brain trauma. Sheriff remained in a coma for 5 months as doctors attempted to treat the brain swelling and damage caused by the attack. Her family maintained hope during those months, staying by her bedside and praying for her recovery. However, the injury proved too severe, and Sheriff passed away 5 months after the initial attack. The medical cause of death was determined to be brain swelling resulting from the penetrating injury to her skull. The investigation began immediately after the initial attack, with Metropolitan Police collecting evidence from the scene and interviewing witnesses who had observed the confrontation. A crucial piece of evidence came from Douglas's own electronic communication. She had sent a message on BlackBerry describing the encounter, writing about seeing someone she disliked and acknowledging that she had harmed that person. This message provided clear evidence of her awareness and acknowledgement of her actions. Douglas was arrested the day after the initial attack in the Pimlico area of London. During police interviews, investigators gathered information about the relationship between Douglas and Sheriff, learning that the motive centered on personal dislike fueled by gossip and disputes. The prosecution would later argue that Douglas had acted with intense animosity toward Sheriff, with the confrontation representing an escalation of ongoing tensions. The trial took place at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court, in July 2012. Prosecutors presented the forensic evidence showing how the metal comb had caused Sheriff's fatal brain injury, along with the electronic communications that demonstrated Douglas's awareness of what she had done. Judge Nicholas Cook presided over the case, ultimately finding Douglas guilty of the most serious charge. During sentencing on August 28, 2012, Judge Cook described the attack as being carried out in a state of intense fury. He also took the unusual step of warning the public about the potential dangers of metal combs when used as weapons, noting that many people might not realize such everyday grooming items could cause fatal injuries. His remarks prompted discussions about weapon awareness and how ordinary objects could become dangerous in confrontations. Douglas received a life sentence with a minimum term of 10 years before being eligible for parole consideration. The defense had presented information about Douglas's difficult childhood and the instability she had experienced, including her homelessness at such a young age. However, the court determined that the severity of the crime and the loss of Sheriff's life warranted a significant sentence despite Douglas's youth. Sheriff's father, Rauf, provided a victim impact statement describing the attack as wicked, savage, and senseless. The family expressed their profound grief at losing Julie and their frustration that such a promising young life had been cut short over what began as a street argument. The case received significant media attention in the United Kingdom, particularly regarding the use of a grooming tool as a deadly weapon. As of 2025, Douglas remains incarcerated, serving her life sentence. The case continues to be cited in discussions about youth interpersonal conflict and how disputes can escalate into tragedies. But the next case would involve a more organized plan for revenge. Cretia Beyonce Stroud. On April 5, 2024, emergency services in Gateshead, England, responded to a stabbing incident that resulted in the death of 40-year-old Gary Belfield and serious injuries to his brother. The attack had been planned and orchestrated by 15-year-old Cretia Beyonce Stroud, who recruited 2 male accomplices to carry out the assault. The incident stemmed from a dispute over a dog that had allegedly been stolen. Stroud had been born and raised in the Newcastle area, and records indicated she had experienced a troubled childhood involving neglect, early exposure to substances, and post-traumatic stress. By the time she was 15, she had developed patterns of behavior that included planning confrontations and seeking revenge for perceived wrongs. The conflict over the dog had escalated in her mind to the point where she decided that serious harm was warranted. Stroud recruited Leandro Lopez, who was 17, and Jordan Tams, also 17, to assist with the attack. The 3 planned the assault together, with Stroud taking a leadership role in organizing when and where it would occur. On the designated day, they approached Belfield and his brother, initiating the confrontation that led to the stabbing. Belfield sustained multiple wounds and died at the scene, while his brother survived but suffered serious injuries. The investigation by Northumbria Police involved reviewing extensive CCTV footage from the area, which captured the movements of all 3 perpetrators before, during, and after the attack. Witnesses who had been in the vicinity provided statements describing what they had observed. The forensic evidence collected from the scene confirmed the nature of the injuries and established how the attack had unfolded. All 3 suspects were arrested shortly after the incident. During police interviews, investigators gathered information about the planning that had preceded the attack and the dispute over the dog that had motivated it. Stroud's background was examined, revealing her history of behavioral issues and the trauma she had experienced. However, prosecutors argued that her age and background did not excuse the premeditated nature of the attack. The trial took place in December 2024, with all 3 defendants denying the charges against them. The prosecution presented the CCTV evidence, witness testimony, and forensic findings to demonstrate how the attack had been planned and executed. The defense teams for each defendant presented mitigating factors, including their ages and personal circumstances. However, the jury found all 3 guilty of the most serious charges, including causing Belfield's death and the attempted harm of his brother. Sentencing occurred on January 30th, 2025. Stroud received a life sentence with a minimum term of 20 years before being eligible for parole consideration, while Lopez and Tams each received life sentences with minimum terms of 26 years. The judge noted the planned nature of the attack and the lack of remorse shown by the defendants. As of 2025, Stroud and Lopez remain incarcerated. The case prompted discussions about juvenile crime, gang dynamics, and the escalation of disputes into serious harm. The next case would involve a different dynamic with 2 perpetrators working together. Holly Ann Harvey and Sandra Ketchum. On August 2, 2004, authorities in Fayette County, Georgia, responded to a residence where two elderly individuals had been found deceased. Holly Ann Harvey, who was 15, and her girlfriend, Sandra Ketchum, who was 16, had attacked Harvey's grandparents, 74-year-old Carl Collier and 73-year-old Sarah Collier. The couple had been responsible for raising Harvey after her parents were unable to care for her due to their own legal troubles. Harvey had been living with her grandparents for several years, and they had provided stability and care during her upbringing. However, tensions had developed in the household when the Colliers discovered that Harvey was in a romantic relationship with Ketchum. The grandparents disapproved of the relationship and had attempted to keep the two girls separated, believing they were too young for such an intense involvement and concerned about the influence each girl was having on the other. The relationship between Harvey and Ketchum had become increasingly important to both girls, and they viewed the grandparents' interference as an obstacle that needed to be removed. The two planned the attack together, making lists and discussing how they would carry it out. On the day of the incident, they lured the Colliers to the basement of the home under a pretense, then initiated the attack using knives from the kitchen. Forensic evidence revealed that the Colliers were attacked with multiple stabs, over 35 wounds combined between both victims. Carl Collier's aorta was severed during the attack, causing rapid blood loss. Sarah Collier also sustained fatal injuries. After the attack, Harvey and Ketchum took the Colliers' pickup truck, money, and jewelry, then fled the residence. They drove away from Georgia, heading toward a beach destination. The investigation began when family members discovered the scene and contacted authorities. Police issued alerts for the stolen truck and began searching for the two girls. They were located and apprehended days later in Tybee Island, Georgia. During the arrest, investigators noticed that Harvey had written the words "for Sandy" on her arm, apparently referring to her relationship with Ketchum as motivation for the crime. During police interviews, both girls provided information about the planning and execution of the attack. Investigators learned about the lists they had made and the discussions they had held about removing the obstacle of Harvey's grandparents. The forensic evidence from the scene corroborated their accounts and established the sequence of events. The planned nature of the crime, combined with the theft of property afterward, painted a picture of premeditation rather than a spontaneous act. The legal proceedings involved both girls initially being charged as adults, given the severity of the crimes. However, their ages became a central consideration during sentencing discussions. Both accepted plea agreements rather than proceeding to trial. Harvey pleaded guilty to 2 counts of malice taking of life, while Ketchum entered similar pleas. Both received life sentences, but with different considerations for parole eligibility due to their ages at the time of the crime and subsequent legal developments regarding juvenile sentencing. As of 2025, both women remain incarcerated, with parole eligibility dates that have been subject to legal review given changes in laws regarding juvenile sentencing. The case continues to be discussed in legal circles regarding appropriate sentences for juvenile offenders who commit serious crimes against family members. The next case would involve an especially vulnerable victim: murder of Angela Wrightson. On December 8, 2014, emergency services in Hartlepool, England, discovered Angela Wrightson deceased in her home. The 39-year-old woman had been attacked by 2 girls in an incident that lasted several hours through the night. Angela was known in her neighborhood as someone who was vulnerable due to personal struggles with substance issues and social isolation, and she had sometimes allowed young people into her home, apparently seeking companionship and social interaction, despite the obvious risks this posed to her safety. The 2 perpetrators, whose identities were protected by court order due to their ages, were 13 and 14 at the time of the attack. They had encountered Angela in the neighborhood and gone to her residence on the evening of December 7th. What began as what appeared to be a social visit escalated into an attack that continued through the night into the early morning hours of December 8th, with the assault lasting far longer than would be characteristic of a spontaneous confrontation. Forensic examination revealed that Angela had sustained over 100 separate injuries distributed across her body. The attack involved the use of various objects found in her home, including household items such as furniture legs, tools, and other implements that were wielded as weapons during the prolonged assault. The medical examiner determined that the cumulative effect of the numerous injuries caused her death, with the assault having been extended over several hours rather than being a brief confrontation, suggesting sustained and repeated harm. One of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation was the discovery that the perpetrators had documented parts of the attack using their mobile phones. They had taken photographs during the assault, including images where they posed with Angela while she was clearly injured and in distress. They also made phone calls to friends during the incident, seemingly treating the situation as entertainment or something to boast about, rather than recognizing the serious harm they were inflicting on a vulnerable human being. The investigation began when Angela's body was discovered by authorities conducting a welfare check. The extent of the injuries immediately indicated that this was a serious criminal matter requiring extensive investigation. Northumbria police collected forensic evidence from the scene, including DNA and fingerprints. They also examined the digital evidence from the girls' mobile phones, which provided detailed documentation of their presence and actions. Both girls were arrested and interviewed by police. During questioning, investigators gathered information about their backgrounds and what had led to the attack. One girl came from a home where she had been exposed to challenging circumstances, while the other had a history of running away from care placements. Both had been known to social services prior to this incident. The trial took place with significant legal proceedings regarding the protection of the perpetrators' identities. The court heard evidence about the attack, including testimony from forensic experts about Angela's injuries. The defense teams presented information about the girls' troubled backgrounds and their lack of maturity. However, the prosecution emphasized the prolonged nature of the attack, the use of multiple weapons, and the callous behavior of photographing the victim during the assault. Both girls were convicted of taking Angela's life. Due to their ages, there were extensive legal arguments about appropriate sentencing for juvenile offenders who commit such serious crimes. The judge ultimately sentenced both to life terms with minimum periods of 15 years before parole eligibility. The sentence reflected both the severity of the crime and the consideration of their ages and circumstances. As of 2025, both perpetrators remain incarcerated under lifelong anonymity orders that prevent the publication of their names or identifying information. The case continues to be referenced in discussions about juvenile justice and the protection of vulnerable adults. If you've made it this far and enjoyed deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. While that case involved two perpetrators, the next would feature a sole teenage offender. Lisa Healy. In 1998, authorities in Failsworth, Manchester, responded to a missing person report regarding 71-year-old Lily, who had not been seen for several days. What investigators discovered would reveal that two teenage girls, Lisa Healy, who was 15, and Sarah Davy, who was 14, had been involved in a crime against the elderly woman. The case shocked the Manchester community and raised concerns about vulnerable elderly individuals living alone. Lily had been a pensioner living independently in her home, where she occasionally had visitors from the neighborhood. She was known as someone who would invite young people into her residence for tea and conversation, apparently seeking companionship in her later years. This openness would prove tragic when Healy and Davy came to visit her residence on what appeared to be a social call. According to the investigation, what began as a visit escalated into an attack against Lily in her own home. The details that emerged during the legal proceedings indicated that the elderly woman had been subjected to sustained harm over a period of time. After the attack, Healy and Davy disposed of Lily's body by placing it in a bin and later moving it to a canal where it would eventually be discovered by authorities conducting a search. The investigation revealed additional aspects that demonstrated the calculated nature of the crime. After harming Lily, the two girls had used her telephone to make calls and had accessed her pension, suggesting they had remained in her home for some time after the attack. These actions indicated awareness of what they had done and an attempt to benefit from the situation, rather than seeking help or reporting what had occurred. Forensic evidence collected from Lily's home and from the location where her body was found helped investigators piece together what had happened. The autopsy revealed the extent of the harm that had been inflicted on the elderly woman. The evidence supported charges against both Healy and Davy, who were arrested and faced serious legal proceedings given the severity of the crime against a vulnerable victim. The motive for the attack appeared to be opportunistic rather than planned in advance. Both girls came from troubled backgrounds, though specific details about their family situations were limited in available records. The investigation focused on establishing what had occurred and holding the perpetrators accountable rather than extensively exploring underlying causes. Both girls were convicted in 1999 of taking Lily's life. Davy received an indeterminate sentence, which meant she would be held until authorities determined she no longer posed a risk to public safety. Healy also received a custodial sentence that reflected the severity of the crime and her age at the time. The case proceeded through the legal system, with both defendants serving time in juvenile facilities, initially before being transferred to adult facilities as they aged. The indeterminate nature of Davy's sentence meant that her release would depend on assessments of her rehabilitation and risk level. Healy's sentence had more defined parameters, though she too would need to demonstrate rehabilitation before being considered for release. Healy was released from custody in 2009 after serving approximately 10 years, having given birth while incarcerated following a relationship with another inmate. Upon release, she was provided with a new identity and conditions for her supervision in the community. The decision to grant her a new identity was based on concerns about public reaction and her ability to reintegrate into society. Davy's path to release was more complicated due to the indeterminate nature of her sentence. She was released in March 2024 after spending decades in custody with multiple recalls for violations of her release conditions, including incidents related to substance issues. Her repeated returns to custody demonstrated the challenges of successful reintegrations for individuals who commit serious crimes as juveniles. As of 2025, both women remain free in the community under supervision conditions that include restrictions on their movements and regular check-ins with authorities. Their cases continue to be cited in discussions about appropriate sentences for juvenile offenders and the effectiveness of rehabilitation programs for young people who commit serious crimes. The next case would involve a different kind of relationship and motive. Christina Adkins. In 2006, authorities in Lenawee County, Michigan, investigated the death of 53-year-old Virginia Bentley, who had been found deceased in her home. The investigation would reveal that her granddaughter, 13-year-old Christina Adkins, had been responsible for her death through poisoning. The case shocked the local community and raised questions about family dynamics and the warning signs that might have been missed. Virginia Bentley had been raising Christina since she was 8 months old, effectively serving as her primary caregiver and parental figure throughout her childhood. The grandmother and granddaughter had shared a home for over 12 years, with Bentley providing stability and care for Christina as she grew up. However, by the time Christina reached her early teenage years, their relationship had become strained. Records indicated that Christina had been struggling with mental health issues and had developed problems with substance use by age 13. There had been conflicts between Christina and her grandmother regarding homeschooling arrangements and behavioral expectations. These tensions had been building in the household, though there were no reports suggesting anyone anticipated the tragedy that would occur. The method of harm involved Christina obtaining morphine pills and slipping them into her grandmother's regular medication. Bentley, who had legitimate medical conditions requiring medication, ingested the morphine without realizing it had been added to her pills. The poisoning was not immediately obvious, and it was only after Bentley's death that investigators began to suspect that her death had not been from natural causes. The autopsy and toxicology results revealed the presence of morphine at levels that indicated an overdose. This finding prompted investigators to examine how Bentley could have obtained such a quantity of the medication and whether her death had been accidental or intentional. The investigation into Christina's activities and access to medications led authorities to determine that she had been responsible for administering the fatal dose. When confronted by investigators, Christina provided information about what had happened. The motive for the poisoning remained somewhat unclear throughout the investigation and legal proceedings. Unlike cases driven by clear disputes or immediate conflicts, Christina's actions appeared to stem from a complex mix of factors, including her mental health struggles, substance issues, and the tensions in the household. During legal proceedings, Christina expressed remorse for what had happened, stating that she was sorry and acknowledging that she had taken the life of someone she loved. This expression of regret became part of the defense's presentation to the court, as they argued for consideration of her age and circumstances. However, the prosecution emphasized the calculated nature of poisoning as a method and the betrayal of trust involved when a grandchild harms the grandparent who raised them. Christina pleaded guilty to second-degree charges related to her grandmother's death. The court sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years, meaning she would be eligible for parole consideration in 2037. The sentence reflected both the seriousness of the crime and consideration of her youth at the time it was committed. But the next case would involve group dynamics and a planned attack. Charlie K. Ely. In April 2011, authorities in Marion County, Florida, investigated the disappearance of a teenage boy who had been reported missing by his family. The investigation would lead to Charlie K. Ely, who was 18 at the time of her trial, and revealed that she had been involved in luring the victim to a location where he was attacked by a group. The case involved multiple perpetrators working together in what prosecutors described as a planned and coordinated assault. Ely had a documented history of mental health struggles, including bipolar disorder and depression, conditions that had affected her functioning and decision-making. These diagnoses would later be presented during legal proceedings as context for understanding her state of mind. Though prosecutors argued they did not excuse her participation in the crime, the incident appeared to stem from ongoing disputes and conflicts that had developed over time. The plan involved Ely contacting the victim and convincing him to come to a residence where she would be present. The victim, believing he was meeting with Ely for a conversation or reconciliation of some kind, arrived at the location. However, what he encountered was not a meeting, but rather an ambush by multiple individuals who had been waiting for his arrival. The attack that followed was severe and involved multiple forms of harm. Forensic evidence revealed that the victim had been beaten, shot, and his remains had been burned in an attempt to conceal evidence of the crime. The level of violence and the subsequent attempts to destroy evidence demonstrated planning and awareness of the criminal nature of the actions. Investigators worked to identify all individuals involved and determine each person's specific role in the crime. Ely's role had been crucial in getting the victim to the location where the attack occurred. Without her involvement in the luring, the other perpetrators would not have had the opportunity to carry out their plan. This made her participation essential to the crime's execution, even if she had not personally inflicted all of the harm. The legal concept of felony involvement meant that all participants could be held responsible for the outcome. The investigation involved multiple arrests as authorities identified each person who had participated in the attack or the cover-up afterward. The complexity of having multiple defendants meant that prosecutors had to establish each individual's role and level of culpability. Some participants received more severe sentences than others based on their specific actions and degree of involvement. Ely was convicted of first-degree charges and initially received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, her case was later reviewed in light of evolving legal standards regarding sentences for juvenile offenders. The review process considered her age, mental health diagnoses, and whether life without parole was constitutionally appropriate for someone who had been young at the time of the crime. During the original sentencing, the victim's mother had provided a powerful impact statement expressing her lack of sympathy for Ely's tears and emotional displays in court. The mother's statement emphasized that Ely had participated in taking her son's life and that any remorse shown in court came too late to prevent the tragedy or restore what had been lost. Following legal review, Ely's sentence was reduced from first-degree to second-degree provisions, and she was released from custody in 2020 after serving approximately 9 years. The reduction reflected considerations about juvenile sentencing and rehabilitation potential. Her release sparked mixed reactions, with the victim's family expressing frustration that she was free while their loved one remained gone. As of 2025, Ely has maintained a private life with no public updates about her activities or whereabouts. The conditions of her release would typically include supervision and restrictions, though specific details are not publicly available. Her case continues to be cited in discussions about appropriate sentences for juvenile offenders who participate in group crimes. The next case would involve a family relationship and recent circumstances. Sofia Koval. In May 2024, authorities in Florida responded to a residence where an elderly woman had been found deceased. The investigation revealed that 14-year-old Sofia Koval had been responsible for her grandmother's death following a dispute in the household. The case raised questions about family dynamics, cultural displacement, and the impact of trauma on young people. Sofia was a Ukrainian immigrant who had witnessed war in her home country before being separated from her mother and coming to live with her grandmother, 79-year-old Yevgenia Koval, in the United States. The displacement and separation from her mother had been traumatic experiences for Sofia, who was trying to adapt to a new country and culture while dealing with the psychological effects of what she had witnessed in Ukraine. She had been exhibiting behavioral issues that concerned her family and caregivers. The incident occurred after Sofia's grandmother confiscated her phone, apparently as a disciplinary measure in response to Sofia's behavior or phone usage. This action triggered an extreme reaction from Sofia, who became angry about losing access to her device. What followed was an attack on her grandmother, using items that were readily available in the home, including the elderly woman's walker and a belt. Forensic examination revealed that Yevgenia had sustained multiple injuries, including bruises across her body, consistent with being struck repeatedly. The medical examiner determined that the cumulative effect of these injuries caused her death, ruling it a case of harm rather than natural causes or accident. The evidence indicated that the attack had continued over a period of time rather than being a single impulsive act. When questioned by investigators, Sofia made statements that revealed her mindset during and after the incident. She rationalized what had happened by suggesting that her grandmother had already been dying, as if this somehow lessened the severity of her actions. This rationalization demonstrated a disconnect between her actions and their consequences, possibly reflecting her young age and inability to fully comprehend what she had done. Sophia also expressed remorse when speaking with her father about what had happened, indicating that she did experience some level of understanding that she had done something wrong. However, the rationalization statements suggested that this understanding was incomplete or mixed with attempts to justify her behavior. The psychological evaluation that followed her arrest would explore these conflicting elements of her response. The legal proceedings involved considerations about Sophia's age, her background as a refugee who had experienced war trauma, and her mental state at the time of the incident. She ultimately pleaded no contest to manslaughter charges, which meant she did not admit guilt, but acknowledged that the prosecution had sufficient evidence for a conviction. This plea allowed the case to proceed to sentencing without a trial. The court sentenced Sophia to a juvenile program that could last up to 36 months rather than imposing an adult prison sentence. This decision reflected considerations about her age, her background, and the potential for rehabilitation through appropriate intervention. The juvenile program would provide mental health treatment, education, and counseling aimed at addressing the factors that contributed to her actions. As of 2025, Sophia remains in the juvenile program. There have been discussions about her immigration status and whether she might face deportation proceedings after completing the program, given that she is not a U.S. citizen. Another case would demonstrate how loyalty in relationships can lead to tragedy. Janine Gonzalez. In August 2022, authorities in Gwinnett County, Georgia, investigated the death of 24-year-old Ashley Bocanegra, who had been found deceased after being reported missing. The investigation revealed that 17-year-old Janine Gonzalez and her accomplice, Antonetta Stevens, had been involved in an attack on Bocanegra. The case centered on a romantic conflict involving Janine's brother and would raise questions about misplaced loyalty and the deadly consequences of relationship disputes. Janine Gonzalez was the sister of Daniel Gonzalez, who had been involved in a romantic relationship with Ashley Bocanegra. The relationship had ended, and Daniel had become engaged to Antonetta Stevens. However, Ashley was pregnant, which created a complicated situation involving all the parties. Janine and Antonetta developed a plan to confront Ashley about the situation, motivated by what they described as loyalty and what they termed as following a code among women. The two women lured Ashley to an apartment under false pretenses, making her believe she was meeting for a conversation or resolution of the situation. However, when Ashley arrived at the location, instead of a discussion, she was attacked by both Janine and Antonetta. The assault was severe and prolonged, with both perpetrators participating in harming Ashley. Forensic evidence revealed that Ashley had sustained blunt force trauma to her head and body, which caused brain hemorrhaging. The medical examiner determined that these injuries were the cause of her death. The severity and nature of the injuries indicated that significant force had been used during the attack and that it had continued beyond what would be necessary to simply subdue someone. After the attack, Janine and Antonetta attempted to cover up what they had done. However, the investigation moved quickly, with authorities identifying them as suspects based on Ashley's last known contacts and witnesses who had seen her going to meet them. Both women were arrested in August 2022, shortly after Ashley's body was discovered. During police interviews, investigators observed concerning behavior from Janine. Reports indicated that she laughed during parts of her interrogation, suggesting a lack of appropriate emotional response to the severity of what had occurred. This behavior, combined with evidence that both women had bragged about the attack afterward to others, painted a picture of perpetrators who did not fully grasp or care about the gravity of their actions. There was also evidence that Janine and Antonetta had made social media posts or statements after the attack that demonstrated awareness of what they had done. The content of these communications would be used by prosecutors to establish that they knew their actions were wrong and had resulted in Ashley's death, countering any potential defense arguments about lack of intent or awareness. Both Janine Gonzalez and Antonetta Stevens were convicted of voluntary manslaughter and robbery charges. The robbery charge stemmed from evidence that they had taken items belonging to Ashley during or after the attack. The voluntary manslaughter conviction, rather than the most serious charges, reflected legal arguments about intent and premeditation, though both charges still carried substantial prison time. Each woman received a sentence of 20 years in prison. For Janine, who was 17 at the time of the crime, this meant she would be incarcerated through her 20s and into her 30s. Her projected release date is in 2042, when she will be in her late 30s and will have spent the majority of her adult life in custody. As of 2025, both Janine Gonzalez and Antonetta Stevens remain incarcerated serving their sentences. The final case would involve ongoing legal proceedings and an uncertain outcome. Natasha Ellis. In May 2019, authorities in New Carlisle, Ohio, responded to a stabbing incident that left one person deceased and others injured. The investigation revealed that 15-year-old Natasha Ellis had orchestrated the attack along with a 13-year-old accomplice. The case would become complicated by legal proceedings that included convictions, appeals, sentence reversals, and re-indictments, making it one of the more legally complex juvenile cases in recent Ohio history. Ellis had what was described as a troubled background, though specific details about her family situation and early life remained limited in public records. What was clear was that by age 15, she had become involved in serious criminal activity. The victim in the case was Lee Moore, who was 36 years old. And there were also other individuals who sustained injuries during the incident but survived. The attack involved stabbing, with forensic evidence revealing multiple stab wounds on the victims. The medical examiner determined that Moore's wounds were fatal, while the other victims required medical treatment but recovered from their injuries. The use of a weapon and the targeting of multiple people suggested a level of planning, or at least an escalation beyond a spontaneous confrontation. The investigation into the incident involved interviewing witnesses, collecting forensic evidence from the scene, and questioning both Ellis and her 13-year-old accomplice. The younger girl's involvement raised additional legal questions about how to proceed with charges against someone so young. While Ellis, at 15, was considered old enough to potentially face serious consequences depending on how charges were filed. Ellis was arrested in May 2019. Shortly after the incident occurred, during the legal proceedings that followed, she expressed remorse for what had happened. In interviews or statements, she said she was sorry for everything, acknowledging the pain caused to the victims and their families. This expression of remorse became part of the consideration during sentencing discussions. Though prosecutors emphasized that remorse did not undo the harm that had been inflicted. Ellis pleaded guilty to charges related to Moore's death and the attempted harm of the other victims. The guilty plea allowed the case to proceed to sentencing without a trial, though it meant Ellis was accepting responsibility for what had occurred. The court initially sentenced her to 22 years in prison, which would have meant she would serve time well into her 30s before being eligible for release. However, the case took an unexpected turn when Ellis's conviction and sentence were reversed on appeal. The appellate court identified legal issues with how the case had been handled, determining that errors had occurred that warranted overturning the conviction. This reversal meant that Ellis would need to be either released or re-prosecuted, depending on whether authorities chose to pursue the case again. In 2022, Ellis was re-indicted on charges related to the case indicating that prosecutors had decided to pursue a new trial rather than accepting the reversal as final. This decision meant that the case would go through legal proceedings again, with both sides having the opportunity to present evidence and arguments. The re-indictment raised questions about whether the outcome would be the same or different given the issues identified by the appellate court. As of 2025, Ellis remains in a state of legal limbo, awaiting retrial or further proceedings related to the re-indictment. The uncertainty of her situation, years after the original incident, represents an unusual aspect of her case compared to others where convictions and sentences have been finalized. The delays and legal complications have extended the resolution process far beyond what typically occurs in juvenile cases, leaving both Ellis and the victims' families without final closure. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.